Paul was busy reading in the library staff room, and because his head was buried in a Haynes manual, he only heard part of Naomi's latest story. But he noticed Vicky pick up a book from the table and remove a feather that had been used as a bookmark. It was amazing what librarians found when books were returned. Someone once used a slice of crispy bacon as a bookmark. In another he'd found a love letter and a lottery ticket. No money, though. Oh, and a bizarre photo of someone's cat in fancy dress. In fact, only recently, Paul had found dried waterweed in a book about Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. When Paul walked home from work that night, the air was crackling with electricity. He was keen to get back because his library book, UFO Investigations 1892 to the present day, was heavy in his rucksack. He'd been fascinated by ufology since he was a lad. Why, that's why he liked to walk home along the canal. He reckoned that this stretch of water had the most alien spacecraft sightings in Scotland. And he knew because he was there. Yeah, back in the 90s. Paul was wearing a black beanie hat under his head torch. It was suddenly cold, and he decided to run the next stretch of the canal to warm up. He was sweating as he approached the bridge. At first he thought he saw a seagull was sitting on the railings, but as he got closer he found it was a man in a pair of red long johns, sitting cross-legged under a street lamp. He had a needle and thread in his hand, and he was mending a pair of soft leather pants. On his head he had a Native American Indian headdress. The headband had small polished glass beads. They sparkled in the lamplight, and, well, the long feathers he'd mistaken for a seagull were strung together neatly with leather thongs. They fell down either side of his red face and over his shoulders, and as Paul admired them, he noticed the gap. One feather was missing. Happy to stop and catch his breath, Paul decided there was something interesting about this character. His matted hair looked like a shaggy wig, and his face, wrinkled like a walnut. It was a very strange shade of red. Under the street lamp, there on the bridge, the air felt hot and heavy. "Looks like we might be in for some thunder," Paul suggested politely. The old man shook his head and continued to repair his pants. "You look like you've been in the wars," Paul joked. The old man scowled, and on he sewed. "I see you've lost a feather," Paul pointed out. The old man put down his needle and slowly shut his eyes. Paul saw a tear run down the old man's cheek. Left behind a pale tributary on his face. A pink stain started to bloom on his vest as it dripped from his chin. Then Paul realised that the feather bookmark he had seen at work in the library earlier was a perfect match. "Did you leave your feather in the library book?" Paul asked. "What? Library? Library? Library?" He kept repeating the word library like a mantra. Well, perhaps he was trying not to forget where he'd left that missing feather, or perhaps he'd never heard of a library before. To Paul it sounded like a spell the man was reciting. "Well, if you call in, I can get it back to you," Paul suggested. Each feather is a badge of honour for bravery." And then another tear travelled down the man's face. An owl hooted, and Paul turned to look up the canal. And then a roll of thunder echoed under the bridge, and splash! Paul turned to find the old man had gone. He ran down onto the towpath to the nearest orange life-preserver, but the ring had been stolen, and when he looked back at the canal, all he could see were some bubbles rising from the black water. So Paul pulled off his trainers and dived into the canal to save a life. Paul was a tall man, but still he found himself sinking down, down, deeper and down. Oh, he realised he had the heavy rucksack on his back, with the Haynes manual inside. He shrugged off one shoulder and was about to abandon it when his feet touched the bottom of the canal. Paul's head torch shone on lots and lots of old junk. Witches' cauldrons, rusting stoves, old cannon, and lots of soup ladles. Oh, and hundreds of cold iron horseshoes. Paul picked one up and put it in his pocket for luck. And then he realised he'd been holding his breath all this time, and looking up he could see the arch under the bridge, and realised he was in, what looked like a snow dome. But instead of snowflakes, it was full of bubbles of air. He caught a bubble of air in his mouth and realised he could breathe. The bubbles appeared to be coming from a bubble machine, and that looked curiously like a giant chocolate fountain. But when he swam over, he noticed that there were words on the side of the iron fountain. "Waste not, want not." Paul walked around the fountain, and on the back were more letters. "Property of the Calcutta Water Company." Paul had never been to Calcutta, but somehow he liked the taste of these Calcutta water bubbles, or rather Calcutta air bubbles. In fact, the bubbles tasted sweet and tickled the inside of his nose. He felt like a kid again. Suddenly Paul saw a giant horse galloping towards him. Its eyes were wild. The horse slowed and came to a halt in front of Paul, and as it shook its great head and reared, its long mane shimmered. Paul looked up at the horse. He wanted to touch its soft muzzle, but the horse's shoulder was an arm's length above his head. Now, if he'd had a bridle on, he could have held on to it. Then Paul realised he had an apple in his rucksack, so he rummaged in the deep side pocket, grabbed the apple, and just as he swung the rucksack back on his shoulders, he realised he was being watched. As he lifted his head slowly, the horse's head descended, and Paul came eye to eye with the beast. And the huge horse did not blink. Paul liked anything out of the ordinary, and there was nothing ordinary about this evening so far. So he reached out with his right hand and touched the mane. It was matted with waterweed. And then he realised he couldn't let go. He put the apple in his teeth and tried to untackle his right hand with his left, and then found both hands were stuck. And then the horse shook its huge head, and Paul was lifted up onto its back. The horse galloped away, and as it did so, it bared its yellow teeth and screamed. With the apple still clenched in his teeth, Paul's eyes were almost as wild as those of the phantom horse. But they jumped bridges and leapt over locks, and soon they entered a long tunnel. A row of old lights flickered along the arched walls. Paul could see a long shadow, a figure silhouetted Oh, a figure of, well, it was unearthly. It was green from top to toe. And something, someone spoke. "Take me to your leader." And to Paul's surprise, the phantom horse he was riding slowed down, stopped, and reared up. "What do you want from the Kelpie king?" "Do I speak to the king himself?" the green being inquired. "No, I am the Duke. Only I or my brother Baron may call on the king. What have you come to ask of the Kelpie king?" "We have come for your barino. We have come for your cola bar. We have come for your sunbar. And above all, we have come for Canera, your giant horse, to pull our intergalactic cart." His head above water now. Well, Paul saw that the green life form wore silver shoes and a soft hat, behind which an army of aliens were marching through the tunnel towards him. More strange beings in green overalls, and the light behind them at the end of the tunnel grew brighter and brighter, blinding Paul. And then he heard a voice. "Paul! Paul! Have you got any cold iron in your pocket?" Paul thought he recognised the voice. Blinded by the light, he couldn't see who was barking orders at him. They sounded confident, though. They sounded like they were in charge. What do I have in my pocket, he wondered. Well, he usually had a box of Tic Tacs, and he always had a 2B pencil, but nothing iron. He kept his keys in his rucksack. Oh, and then he remembered the horseshoe he picked up underneath the water. He pulled his hands away, but he couldn't get his hands unstuck from the horse's mane. And the green army was advancing now down that narrow towpath towards him. Look, there's a fountain of aerated water further down the canal," Paul shouted to the alien leader. "But only the brew will do," the alien replied. Paul realised that the sweet-tasting air bubbles had indeed tasted like Irn-Bru. "Danger! Paul! Duck!" another voice behind him screamed. Paul leant down to see what type of dangerous duck would be swimming around in the canal when he heard a swoosh as something spun through the air over his head. The heavy silver chain landed like a lasso on the giant horse's neck. The horse reared and then disappeared under the water, wearing a glittering silver bridle. And thunder rolled through the tunnel. Paul felt hands grab his hoodie and pull him up onto the narrow walkway. And when he looked up, to his surprise, there were Naomi and Vicky from the library. Vicky was carrying his trainers. Paul realised that his hands were empty apart from waterweed. The 3 librarians were now facing the approaching alien army, and the light at the end of the tunnel grew brighter, and they saw the silhouette of a cigar-shaped object, a tube pointed at both ends. Then suddenly the sound of galloping hooves and whoops and war cries echoed down the tunnel behind them, and Paul turned to see the man with the feather headdress galloping towards him, followed by a posse of cowboys. They were trapped in the middle of the tunnel between 2 opposing war parties. The noise was deafening, and the air crackled. And then a speedboat roared through Prospect Hill Tunnel. "Cut, cut, cut!" a void shouted, and silence fell in the tunnel. "What are you 3 doing here?" a man in a black cap, clutching a black clapperboard, cried, reaching behind his ear for a piece of chalk. Paul and Vicky and Naomi, they were lost for words. "You've just ruined a perfectly good take. Have you any idea how long that take took to set up?" the director man asked. "What's your name and where do you come from?" Naomi asked, taking charge. "With the BA Cowboys. OK, let's reset and we'll go again." The 3 librarians were shooed along the tunnel and out of shot by the alien commander. And under a street lamp, Vicky and Naomi realized that they had met this person before. "You'll be needing this," she whispered, as she slipped a small, soft object into Naomi's hand. "Take 2, action!" the director barked, and the clapperboard slammed shut. On the Monday of Book Week Scotland, the 3 librarians held an impromptu meeting in the staff room. On the table in front of them were 3 items up for discussion: a white feather, a horseshoe, and a pink knitted big toe. "No one is going to believe our stories are true," Naomi declared. "But our stories did happen, in the past, here in Falkirk," replied Paul. "So how can we explain how we got to travel back in time?" Naomi asked. "Well, you just need to stick your head in a book or look on the web," Vicky suggested. Library, library, library. Paul remembered the old man's chant on the bridge the night before. He thought, good stories can certainly start in a library. Oh, Vicky had another idea, so she held up a hand. "I wonder what other stories Falkirk folk could make up with these 3 objects. An eagle feather, a horseshoe, and a big knitted toe." "Well, they couldn't be weirder than our stories, could they?" Naomi asked. Paul shook his head. He'd been to a fair few sci-fi and viz-com conventions in his time. He knew that stranger things happened along Falkirk's canals. Weirder things happened in Area 51 than even a librarian could ever dream of.